Hi, thank you so much for joining us for this Q&A session on Med Hondo's film Soleil. I'm Lisa Connell, and I'm professor of French in the International Languages and Cultures program. And I'm delighted to have Professor Erin Lee Mock be a part of our Q&A session on Soleil. Dr. Mock is professor of film in the English program and is also director of the film studies minor. She did a great introduction to the film. So if you haven't yet seen that, I highly encourage you to watch that before watching Soleil. She gives you some really, really wonderful context and anchors for when you're watching this very complex, very wonderful film. I'd also like to thank the faculty and students who contributed their questions that we'll be addressing in this talk. So everything that we address today is either faculty or student generated. So again, thank you so much. In your introductory video to the film, you give some really valuable context for Soleil and the ways in which Med Hondo uses this film as a way to give voice to his experiences of racism in France as an immigrant from Mauritania. And you also speak of Hondo's very acute sensitivity to the enduring cultural, political, and economic ramifications of France's colonial history. And as a student of theater from a former French colony, which you do mention in your biographical information of Med Hondo, Hondo experiences the very outsized influence of the French language and French cultural values, which is a huge tension in the film. We see that right away from the opening moments all the way to its ending scene. This was also a very strong impetus for him to make this film. And Soleil, as we'll talk about later through the questions, is a fiercely political film. And it takes us into the heart of the economic and cultural oppression of colonialism, as well as its racist underpinnings. And so in this way, Soleil is part of a broader and global condemnation of colonial oppression, even as it also highlights aspects of France's specific colonial history and post-colonial national and cultural identity. So with this context, we can perhaps begin to answer some of the questions that came in about this film. And it seems like there were two major threads with that we can find in these questions, which is the film's significance, as well as the film's aesthetics. So for the very first question, it's deceptively simple, but it really requires some fine-tuned attention, I think. So why was this film chosen? And I think that we can use a two-pronged approach to answer this film. So I can address why, as part of the organizers of the Tournées French Festival, we chose this film, why we highlighted it. And then also perhaps you can address it from your own perspective as a film scholar. So part of the reason why we chose this film is because of the structuring of the Tournai Film Festival, and participants are required to choose at least one film from a list of classic films. But aside from these sort of organizational constraints, we more importantly chose this film because of our own program's goals of highlighting the diversity of France and the French-speaking world, and by taking into account a plurality of voices and experiences that help make up French and Francophone culture. So additionally, Soleil has come back into a broader discussion of film since it has been recently restored through the efforts of Martin Scorsese's African Film Heritage Project. So that's a preliminary answer, one perspective, but I was wondering how you might respond to this as a film scholar. Why is this film worth choosing?
Well, one thing that I really dig about Soleil is that it's about grave social issues, but it's not social realism.
Hmm.
And nothing against social realism. I love many films in that tradition, but just for me personally, as someone who studies and loves film deeply, and as someone who watches a lot of movies, films that really work out a rhythm like this one, that just resurrects in me personally a desire to see what comes next. And I don't mean narratively, I mean aesthetically. Like, what's gonna happen? What is this person going to do? What are these people going to do to me? And frankly, we live in a period right now in cinematic history, which it's just one of the most aesthetically and philosophically dullest, like, in history. So to me, and this applies to the U.S. and France, by the way. So even when filmmakers are making this stuff that's really important, is tackling really important stuff, and they make an impact with it, it's very rarely challenging philosophically or aesthetically. So if you look at the films in this series, for example, I actually love all of them. It's, you know, beautiful, moving stuff. But Soleil is electrifying. I never know what it's going to do to me. And I say this as someone who's seen it multiple times. There's still this way that my body and mind are engaged second to second.
Well, and I think the film is at once very jarring. It's super, and it's so captivating. And like you say, it's incredibly unpredictable, and you don't know where you're going next. And I think that's one of the really unusual experiences for contemporary viewers that this film gives us. So, and I think that was one, the hour and 40 minutes felt like 20, just because you were for me too, I had that same experience of like not having any idea of where you were going to be led next. So yeah, I think that's a really helpful perspective that you're bringing into, and especially bringing into the importance of why the Tournées Festival always has people require classic films, so we don't lose this sort of contact with a very different aesthetic experience. Yeah. And I think too, what that your response there is helpful, because you're talking about French cinema now, American cinema now, but we also have a question about just the general place of this film within French cinema. And how does this film help us understand Hondo's contribution to French cinema?
Love this question. Early career films are really always worth considering when you're trying to determine the place of a particular artist or filmmaker, and their body of work. And Soleil is no exception. If you look at Hondo's work over time, there is no question that this is the most experimental at the level of filmmaking. And it's not always the case that filmmakers' early work is less compliant with standard formal expectations and norms, but it's often the case because of budgets. So by making do, they make something that's unique and challenging, and that's definitely part of the case with Soleil. In Hondo's case, he's making movies just at the edge of the French New Wave and during the so-called African New Wave. But while he's working at that time and while he's in conversation with those filmmakers, I don't think he's representative in this film. And at the same time, he's capitalizing on that moment, because what he can do in this moment is he can assume that a more challenging cinematic vocabulary is actually legible to French viewers. They'll tolerate and just be able to be at a baseline, be able to understand cinematic experimentation. And obviously he doesn't stop there. We'll talk about it later with the radical and revolutionary potential of non-normative filmmaking. But I think it's worthwhile that he's an artist who straight up loved European classical theater and movies. And we often view non-white artists through the lens of their politics and also in the tradition only of non-white filmmaking. And that's happened a lot with Hondo, where he's just considered part of this movement at this period in his career. But that's almost never the case. Black filmmakers are never just influenced by Black filmmakers. And so, as I said in my intro video, with Hondo, that is not it.
Mm.
He is trying to figure out how to make a film which resists on a very visceral level, but really takes advantage of a moment in French cinematic viewership. And
Mhm.
so, after this, he goes on to make other films, and they're they're not boring or staid or totally conformist, but they definitely conform to certain norms much more so. So right after this, he makes some documentaries, and they're documentaries.
Mm.
It's not like Soleil where it's like, oh, there's a documentary, and oh, there's kind of this classical theater, and there's slapstick, and it's not like that. And then after that, actually in '79, he makes a big budget scripted feature. Um, it's called West Indies. I highly recommend it, actually. Even though it's more traditional, it's interesting and smart in various ways on its own. But I think seeing Soleil is a way to see how this filmmaker, who will eventually become something that, you know, he's very legible
Mm.
in the canon. He's not that with Soleil, and I think that tells us a lot about him as an artist. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. And I love how it sort of enables us to situate Soleil within a specific moment in Hondo's career, but also within French cinema, and also to see that the trajectory is not always going to be predictable, and that there's the importance of taking into account several films when you're talking about a filmmaker's work. It's not going to be representative of just one film or one aesthetic even. And so, and also bringing into account the very, I love how you bring up the fact that there are, of course, going to be multiple influences, and that you can't just attribute it to one, even though a lot of people tend to be tempted to or lured into thinking that this is only going to belong to a certain category of filmmakers, and to forget the fact that you're what you love and what you're going to be working with isn't going to be distilled to one single thing or one single influence. So yeah, no, so that's great.
And I do think that in my intro video, that was one thing I tried to emphasize, is that Hondo is very aware of himself as somebody who is struggling with the ways that he appreciates theater and cinema made outside of his own movement. It's not just that he is appropriating it, for example, or that he's sort of organically influenced by it. He's aware. Mm-hmm. He is working with that. So that's another thing I love about this film, but also later when he gets to his documentaries, when he gets to West Indies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that really comes up to what that point you just spoke to, his sort of hyper awareness of his position as a former colonial citizen of France, right? That in the very first moments of the scene, we see it comes across in the register of language, right? Where in that really strong baptismal scene where the sin is speaking one's language that isn't French. And I think that this gives us a way into thinking about maybe some of the conflicts and the tensions. Like, he makes a very, very strong point to have impeccable French throughout the film, even though this is one of his sins. So it's sins of, having, you see that this is a very, very strong political moment that comes across in the register of language. So, and how the aesthetics play into that too is, I think, going to be something that we'll be able to explore in some of the other questions. In I think one of the first aesthetic questions too that might allow us to take a first step into these broader questions, it regards shooting the film in black and white, So what was the significance of the film being produced in black and white? At the time of it was produced, color film was popular and widely used. So why would the director choose black and white?
I want to first say that I wish the answer were more revolutionary than it is. Just at an industrial level, black and white cinema was not actually unusual for lower budget or avant-garde, or in certain national contexts at the time, like indie film. Black and white was the norm for those kinds of films. It's true that by the 60s, color film was becoming more of the norm, and obviously that would continue to the present. But the use of black and white in experimental cinema really was the norm into the 1980s. And also, this film was made over several years. So when it came out in 1970, right? But it began filming in 66. And you have big time French filmmakers like Rene, Romer. They're working in black and white in the era. So black and white distinguishes Soleil in ways. I'm glad it was shot in black and white. We have no way of knowing. Actually, he's never spoken. To my knowledge, Hondo has never spoken about this as being a choice. I do think, though, that black and white distinguishes Soleil from this sort of luxurious use of color by French filmmakers at the time. I mean, some that you folks who are watching this might know off the top of your head, or like Tati was, his films of the era are just, the use of colors over the top in a beautiful way. He's really rejecting that, though. I don't know that Hondo was able to. It's unlikely that he was able to make much of a choice in this case. So sorry, it's not the most fun answer.
No, I think that's also very instructive, because, one of my first impressions, I was so glad to see this question, because it made me think about, oh, well, he's taking the film is so stark in its condemnation that it's presenting politically a very black and white situation. And so it was like using that as a way to reinforce its message. But so, that was one of my assumptions as a very contemporary viewer. So I think it's great to hear, like, there are other choices besides necessarily artistic ones that go into the choice of black and white, specifically at the time of production of Soleil. Yeah. And we have another aesthetic question. And this kind of leads us more explicitly into the interconnection between the very revolutionary message that we see in the film and some of the aesthetics that might actually carry that, contradict that message, reinforce it, destabilize it. So I think there's just playing with the juxtapositions that we really see throughout the film. So this question asks, some scholars have identified the aesthetics of the film as a, quote, marriage of contradictions. And then this seems to manifest in the film's juxtaposition of sequences that seem like they belong in a documentary, with a strong emphasis on extemporaneous natural footage, to other sequences that are abstract, theatrical, and highly metaphorical. How can we understand the film's shifting and unpredictable blurring of different genres and conventions?
One thing I think is valuable to return to is that Hondo made this film quite collaboratively. He was active in the French theater scene, specifically the more experimental and politically engaged theater scene, which was comprised mostly by African immigrant artists. He was part of the famous theater troupe Brio Shango, and there's just no question that the film aesthetically, the fact that it is so eclectic, does owe something to a more collective filmmaking process. There's a way in which that's inevitable. And there's also no question that, under white supremacy, capitalism, any oppressive system, collectivity and solidarity, those are basically requirements for liberation. You know, Marx tells us this, Fanon tells us this, Guevara tells us this. Americans at that time, like Malcolm X and the Panthers, tell us this. So Soleil is taking that up in the aesthetic project, but also in this process. And I think also these juxtapositions, I think there's a virtuosity to the film. I think it actually brings to light something that Fanon said that really relates to what you were bringing up, Dr. Connell. The mastery of language affords remarkable power. And in that case, he was actually referring to the colonizer. I think it's really interesting to apply here because the term that I mentioned earlier, virtuosity, I feel like it never gets applied to films like Soleil because they aren't polished. But the virtuosity that I'm trying to refer to is just this mastery of different modes and styles. There's this kind of, I'll take your documentary, thank you very much. Like, I'll snatch that slapstick, thank you very much, and thank you for your surrealism. I'm going to use that too. And you know, I think that resonates with Fanon, and you know, it also resonates with the quote in the film, "We'll colonize them back." You know, it's like the Audre Lorde question, whether, you know, to use another revolutionary thinker, whether the master's tools can ever dismantle the master's house. And I think this reveals that these aesthetic elements, when you take them out of this traditional aesthetic context, are actually not the master's tools at all. And I really don't think there could be a more liberatory statement on the potential of art, really. Some political filmmaking movements would definitely disagree with me, and that's a discussion for another day. But I would extend this to say that the formal experimentation really undermines the idea of storytelling. And man, I really wish that cinema did this more now. But anyway, it reaches the proletariat, the colonized, to say traditional European forms of storytelling have been at many times used to justify our disenfranchisement and the violence against us and to erase us. So we are not going to make our experience easily digestible to everyone else. And this is for you, to you, the proletariat subject, but also to say to European cinephiles, and Hondo and his crew, they wanted to reach these European cinephiles too. It wasn't just for each other. And he's basically saying, you got to ride this wave. This man's story is going to be told in a way which will not make you feel like you're in control of, even though this is a story. The story will not offer you the control that white European domination has had on this character's daily life. That's how the story's going to go. And we want you to get it. But we don't have to tell this in the way you expect in order for that to happen. And these aesthetic juxtapositions, I think are really a way of saying, like, look, we'll colonize them too.
I wonder, do you see a moment in the film that sort of exemplifies this virtuosity that you're talking about? Is there a sequence in particular that really struck you? Just a specific moment where you can see this coming into play? The sort of destabilization of a narrative?
I think that's one way of looking at it, and I'm open to talking about that more. But I think what I'm referring to more is that overall there's something virtuosic about ignoring. He's virtuosic in the way that he's able to accomplish a narrative of sorts without really capitulating to traditional forms. I know we're going to talk about the Champs-Élysées scene later, and I can talk about the specifics of that a little bit more. But actually, what I think is virtuosic about it is not about any individual moment, and I would actually the way that this film has been discussed among critics has frequently been to look at it not for its individual aesthetic moments, for it broadly. And often I find that incredibly irritating and short-sighted. In this case, I actually feel differently about it. I actually feel like accounting for the film in its in its coherence, its incoherent coherence, maybe the most radical and connected way of discussing the film. I hope that's okay with you.
No, I think that's it's fascinating to think less about, if I'm understanding, thinking it's for you see an effective inroads into thinking about the film is taking into account the whole and not necessarily chunking it out into individual moments. That's what if I understand you correctly.
Right. And well, we can talk about individual moments. I just kind of wanted to plant my flag on
that. Flag planted. No, I think that's great, and it does give us into it does lead us into our next question, and maybe some of the tensions that we see through these two approaches that are kind of emerging. And so we have a question about the Champs-Élysées scene. One of the most striking and disturbing scenes in the film takes place at the Champs-Élysées, when the Black immigrant protagonist and a blonde woman kiss and flirt with each other before the gaze of Parisian onlookers. Why do you think Hondo chose that location? And what do you think about the way fictional and documentary filmmaking converge during this sequence?
So, yes, I just said we should look at the film as or we should privilege the film as a whole rather than in part, but man, I love this. I love this scene in the film. It's so uncomfortable, and it's also, I think, exhilarating and sickening. I think there are a few ways to read this scene, and particularly its location. And so, one reading is, nothing better represents the power of France and its sort of indulgence in its own splendor, and also the way the nation has represented itself to the world, and so, in one way, this just represents a rebellion against this by our protagonist, right? That's a very available and useful reading. Another thing to think about is that many of the descriptions we have and the visual representations we have of instability in France and occupations of France specifically that take place here. So when you read the history of France, this goes back centuries. This is where we read and hear about and more contemporarily see this happen. So what would have been most recent for Hondo is the march of the Germans when they took France in 1940, and then the French troops and the Americans taking it back in 44. So you might say that it shows the power of France, and that power is embodied by these Parisians, their gaze. At the same time, it shows the seams. As a country, the country is resilient, and some of that resiliency is on the backs of colonization, but it's not an immovable fortress. To me, that that reading of it has a lot more revolutionary potential than like a counter message of just like F you, France. It's like, okay, France, we can take you. It wouldn't be the first time. Like the quote that I was saying earlier, we'll colonize them back. Um, and I think the juxtaposition of forms there is, is partly about taking a place in history. We make this, if we're willing to make this a sort of documentary image, and we're willing to make you concerned about how real this is, we are taking a place in these transitions. We too are showing the seams of this stable French empire, right? By making you wonder about this and by showing this as potentially real. That might be a longer reading than you wanted, but that's where I'm coming from.
No, and I mean, I think it's very, very valuable to take into historical account because, yes, it's absolutely iconic. The Champs-Élysées is one of these scenes of, a celebratory space. It's where Bastille Day, so France's Independence Day, is celebrated there. You have even the Tour de France, that's where we end up. So it's this very celebratory space of a collective French national identity and culture. But at the same time, you also have this ideal, French national identity prides itself on, the liberté, égalité, fraternité, so everybody is equal as a French citizen. So you are French above all else. So with this sort of resistance to any sort of hyphenated identity that in the States is very, very common, and it's a way of an American identity to recognize plurality. But of one French perspective on that, and just one amongst many, is that this sort of breaks up the cohesiveness and the strength that comes from unity, and it kind of undermines this ideal of equality for everybody and for every single French citizen. But I think what this scene shows too is a rupture between that ideal and the reality of racism. That is often a very uncomfortable conversation in France because it is specifically counter to how France wants to maintain a sense of strength and coherence and equality for all citizens, even though, of course, you cannot ignore the blatant racism that comes across in that scene, and that it's just like any society. There are issues of racism then and now, just as there would be in any country. So I think the reading that you propose is very, very helpful. And I think too, that leads us into our last question, which does touch on some of the revolutionary politics and aesthetics of the film, because it does have significant undercurrents of revolutionary post-colonial thought. Like you mentioned Fanon, right? It's with its strong denunciation of the French colonial project and its aftermath, as well as, so it has references and allusions to other revolutionary thinkers, such as Malcolm X, Frantz Fanon, who is explicitly cited, Che Guevara. So how do you think, and these are those references specifically to Malcolm X and Che Guevara at the very end, where this protagonist is having in the middle of a complete crisis, or what that scream means at the end. Is it a revolutionary scream? Is it a scream that signals what, is a very ambiguous scream? Is it a scream of empowerment? Is it a scream of resistance? And maybe it's all things at once, but what do you think the film's, how do you think the film's aesthetics also represent a kind of cinematic revolution, if they do?
Well, I'll first just go back to the idea of the collective. And it's so distant, unfortunately, from us now. But filmmaking is inevitably a collaborative process. It has to be. And for Hondo, that was incredibly important. This film doesn't exist without a bunch of people making it happen. I don't mean the executive producer kind of situation, you know what I mean? I mean a bunch of artists with a lot of different skill sets, including big ticket French actors, but also all these individual hustling artists. And that is absolutely of a piece with revolutionary activism at the moment. In the 1960s, this idea of coalitions, again, you see, by the time this film is made, that is sort of an understanding of what those radical thinkers were invested in, was this idea of making something of difference, of coming together, even if you're from a different country, even if even the site of your oppression is different, because to some extent the perpetrators of oppression are never different. I think that's an interest of Soleil. As far as our protagonist, the idea of the revolutionary scream that is at once of liberation and this palpable rage, that makes sense among all of these thinkers that are referenced here. That is, absolutely what their texts even say. They all say, all of these thinkers that have been mentioned are all very interested in how education is a crucial part of moving people into a sort of revolutionary consciousness. At the same time, all of those, Fanon, Guevara, Malcolm X being the ones explicitly referenced in the film, but there are a lot of implicit references in the film. They're all saying, you got to get together and do. You got to get together and know. You got to get together and do. And the scream is this moment where one can transition from knowing and doing. That's represented in so many, but I think Soleil has a beautiful and wrenching moment of that. So you said, is this all of the above or something along those lines? And I would say absolutely.
And I think that's an interesting way to think about too, with the film and this moment, it's at once a stopping point for the film, but it's a starting point for another broader political project, a broader political coalition, to return to one of the phrases that you use, that is a very uncomfortable place to leave viewers because of all the work that is to do, and I think it's one of the few moments where, you see a very meandering protagonist who eventually is led to this place where it's a turning point. He's obviously at a crossroads. And so I think that one of the real beauties of the film is that it's also inviting us to think about the multiple crossroads that we encounter personally, collectively. And what do we do with that? Obviously, it's what needs to be made. What we're not seeing next. So it's at once an invitation to move forward, even once the screen turns black. So for me, it was a very
right. And how can art help us define purpose, revolutionary purpose? And when you're looking at that particular moment, that's what art, so much activist art, is asking us to do, is to find a revolutionary purpose. So I love the fact that you point out that the moment when it's over, the moment when we face that black screen, what we are left with is determining a kind of purpose, as we have watched our protagonist really without a certainty about whether he can really have purpose.
Yeah, it's so yeah, I mean, I think I can't.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't.
Oh, I can't underestimate, I can't encourage viewers enough to take advantage of this wonderful opportunity to see the film if they haven't yet already. And I think with, you know, those also, it's a great reminder too that our next film is taking up another activist with the life of Nelson Mandela. So, please do, if this Soleil and sort of the history, the aesthetics, the politics of it, the general way that it can encourage us to think about the way art can become something in the world. I encourage you to take part in the next screening, the process against Mandela, so which will be available this coming week. So I can't thank you enough, Dr. Mock, for taking the time to discuss this film, to bring your insights into it. I learned a lot from just being able to talk with you. And again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Connell.
Okay. All right. Bye.